Get that off my floor. Ma'am, Legacy Capital is a private bank, not a bus depot. And we don't waste premium time on folks who look like they walked in off Food Stamp Friday. Those 30 brutal words slapped through the lobby louder than any alarm, ricocheting off brass rails and marble columns until every conversation died mid-sentence. And they marked the exact moment a $6 billion deal began to unravel. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe for more stories where power meets accountability. And like this video if you believe dignity still matters. Now let's step into the very lobby where a 62-year-old woman named Grace Whitaker stood with her purse clutched close, her insurance card and driver's license still warm from her hand, and watched them skid across gleaming Italian marble as if they were trash swept off a back porch. The branch director, a sharply groomed man named Kenneth Blake, had delivered his insult with all the theatrical flair of a traffic cop waving away a stray dog. He adjusted the knot of his silver silk tie, straightened his cufflinks, and smiled to the onlookers as though he had performed a public service. A ripple of discomfort rolled across the room. A teller froze with her finger hovering over a keypad. An older gentleman in a tweed jacket lowered his newspaper. Two young professionals balancing lattes paused mid-sip, their expressions caught somewhere between shock and morbid curiosity. Grace, meanwhile, did not shout, did not tremble, did not even blink. Decades earlier, she had taught herself to store humiliation the way engineers store potential energy, silent, compressed, and ready to power something far larger than the insult itself. She bent slowly, the hem of her gray cardigan brushing the cold tile, retrieved her ID with steady fingers, and straightened to her full height, spine as true as the steel beams she once helped calculate. Her eyes, a deep, unflinching brown, found Kenneth's icy blue stare, and for half a heartbeat the banker felt an unfamiliar chill crawl across the back of his neck. Grace said only, "Thank you for clarifying your policy," in a tone so calm it suggested courtroom transcripts rather than casual conversation. Then she turned on one sensible heel, her steps tapping out a metronome of resolve, and moved toward the revolving doors. Outside, April sunlight refracted through glass, catching the silver strands in her hair as she pulled out her phone to send the briefest of texts. Legacy failed the courtesy test. Call me. That message pinged upstairs in a penthouse conference room where her son, Jonathan J.T. Whitaker, founder and CEO of Whitaker Technologies, sat at the head of a walnut table, pen poised to sign a treasury management agreement that would funnel $6 billion into Legacy's vaults. One glance at the text, one subtle arch of his eyebrow, and the room's temperature seemed to drop. He closed the document folder, thanked the executives for their patience, and stepped into a glass-walled alcove to return his mother's call. As he listened to her recount the scene, license airborne, humiliation public, his jaw tightened. But his voice never rose above a boardroom whisper. He simply flipped to Clause 27 of the draft contract, termination for material ethical breach, and underlined it in decisive blue ink. Meanwhile, back on the lobby floor, Kenneth Blake recounted his triumph to a cluster of junior managers, reenacting Grace's stoop with mocking flair. Laughter fluttered from the group. But none noticed the young teller, Laura Nguyen, sliding her gaze to the corner security camera, her cheeks burning with second-hand shame. Laura excused herself, slipped into the control booth, and copied 30 seconds of high-definition footage onto a thumb drive, her hands trembling at the audacity yet steadied by a conviction that silence is complicity. Across town, traffic lights blinked green and buses rumbled past. But Grace sat on a city bench, smoothing the creases of her slacks, replaying another memory, the late 1984s, When she stood in smaller lobbies wearing the same polite smile and heard equally polished voices explain why her construction plans were too risky for a black woman entrepreneur. She had answered those rejections by mixing concrete herself and raising affordable homes where empty lots once collected trash. Today's insult felt different only in setting, not in substance, and she could already sense the blueprint forming in her mind, one that would test the load limits of Legacy Capital's celebrated reputation. At that very moment, J.T. gathered his legal counsel and finance chief back in the conference room. He spoke softly about fiduciary duty, about silent video evidence, about how brand equity collapses when the foundation is wrought disguised as marble. He instructed his team to prepare contingency liquidity models in case Legacy's deal went dark, and to reach out, quietly, to Commonwealth First Bank, the rival institution that had courted Whitaker Tech months earlier with slightly higher rates but an impeccable equity record. Downstairs, Kenneth finished his performance, basked in a final round of uneasy chuckles, and swaggered back to his corner office dreaming of promotions and stock options, unaware that each echo of his laughter was being etched into a timeline of misconduct. Laura swallowed her fear and slipped the thumb drive into her purse. She did not yet know that her small act of courage would later serve as the keystone of a lawsuit, a policy overhaul, and a nationwide ethics case study. Out on the sidewalk, Grace boarded the number 7 bus. Yes, the mother of a tech CEO still took the bus, a habit left over from leaner years, and watched Legacy's sleek glass facade shrink in the reflection of the window. She allowed herself exactly one breath of weary sorrow, then none. The rest she saved for the work ahead. And so, in less than 5 minutes, a lobby insult had triggered a chain reaction, a text to a son, a thumb drive into a purse, a clause underlined in blue, and a billionaire partnership teetering on the edge. All because one man wearing an Italian tie forgot that some fortunes are measured not in visible wealth, but in the quiet confidence of people who've spent a lifetime turning disrespect into steel. Keep watching, because the next 72 hours will show how quickly arrogance can bankrupt itself, and how a single act of dignity can reset the balance sheet for everyone watching. Jonathan J.T. Whitaker stood at the 33rd floor window of Whitaker Technologies headquarters, Raleigh's skyline reflecting in the glass like a promise he wasn't sure he wanted anymore, and tried to steady his breathing while the muffled chatter of attorneys discussing indemnity clauses buzzed behind him. He had spent 2 years guiding his company to this moment, ready to sign a treasury management deal big enough to fund every quantum sensor prototype on the drawing board. Yet a single text from his mother had cracked the entire foundation, in that instant. Grace's quiet message pulled him back to childhood Saturdays on construction sites, back to the image of her pouring cement at dawn because no bank would lend a black woman the money for a subcontractor. He remembered how she mixed perseverance into that concrete with each shovelful, all the while telling young Jonathan that the true cost of any project is measured in character, not in dollars. The boardroom behind him smelled of fresh coffee, freshly printed contracts, and fresh arrogance. Senior banker Harold Boone cleared his throat, tapping a Mont Blanc pen on a stack of signature pages. "Mr. Whitaker," Boone said, "our vice chair is on a tight schedule, so if we could finalize signatures before lunch, we can toast this partnership properly." J.T. nodded, doing his best to mask the roiling knot in his stomach. He thumbed the edge of the document, found Clause 27, the termination for ethical breach, then underlined it with deliberate pressure that left a faint groove in the expensive paper. Seeing Boone's curious glance, he offered a courteous smile that felt like a mask lighting up on command. Meanwhile, 30 floors below, the lobby returned to its usual hum. Yet the aftershocks of Kenneth Blake's insult still vibrated under the polished surface. Kenneth marched into the executive cafe, tossed his jacket over a leather chair, and launched into a theatrical retelling of how he'd saved the bank from time wasters. Junior managers laughed too loudly, pretended to check their phones. Anything to avoid the uncomfortable truth that their director's words revealed more about him than about the woman he'd shooed away. One of those managers, Marco Ruiz, left under the pretense of finishing a risk assessment report, but really to calm the twist of shame tightening under his ribcage. He had heard versions of that slur directed at his own mother when she tried to open a small grocery store back in Texas, in the security booth. Teller Laura Nguyen slipped the fresh thumb drive into her purse. Heart-hammering. She told herself she would decide later what to do with the footage, but somewhere deeper she already knew. She would send it to someone who could use it. Courage, she'd learned, is often as small as the weight of a USB stick in your pocket. Up in the conference room, J.T. set down his pen and asked if he might have a moment for a quick compliance check. Boone forced a tolerant smile, as if humoring a child fussing over crayons. "Of course," he said. "We aim for full transparency." Yet the impatience in his eyes flashed like a faulty circuit. J.T. stepped into a private glass alcove and called Grace, when she answered. The street sounds of a city bus hissed through the line, and he pictured her sitting near a window, shoulders squared, dignity intact. She relayed Kenneth's exact words, not flinching, almost clinical in her clarity. J.T. felt a hot surge behind his eyes, but Grace's steady voice cooled it, channeling anger into action. "Remember," she said, "profit is replaceable. Character is not." Those words snapped into his spine like rebar. He thanked her, ended the call, then opened a secure chat with his legal team. Item 1, review lobby video, eyewitness statements. Item 2, scenario analysis on immediate contract walkaway. Item 3, discreet inquiry to Commonwealth First. Minutes later, his general counsel, Benjamin Cordell, replied with a single line, "Understood. Gathering evidence now." Downstairs, Kenneth ran out of synonyms for unqualified and ended his performance with a toast, raising a crystal glass of sparkling water to an audience whose laughter had worn thin. Laura watched from the doorway, thumb drive still nestled against her palm, and saw something shift in the younger staffer's eyes, respect sliding out like sand through fingertips. She would later recall that as the moment Kenneth's leadership truly collapsed, when people stopped laughing with him and began enduring him. At 11:32 a.m., Boone returned to the conference room, tension flickering at the corners of his practiced smile. "Mr. Whitaker, shall we proceed?" J.T. closed the contract folder, placed his hands flat on the walnut surface, and asked Boone to clarify Legacy Capital's official policy on client dignity. Boone blinked, surprised. "Client dignity is paramount," he said. "Rehearsed." J.T. leaned in, voice calm but carrying the weight of his company's entire workforce. "I have evidence indicating otherwise," he said, and slid his phone across the table. Screen paused on a text summary of Kenneth Blake's insult. Boone's expression went slack. Board members traded glances before panic could spin outward. J.T. added, "Clause 27 grants us a 72-hour review window in the event of discriminatory conduct. We're activating that window, effective immediately." Boone struggled for a response, but J.T. was already standing, thanking everyone for their time. There would be no champagne toast, at least not here. In the elevator ride down, J.T. stared at his reflection, remembering the nights Grace spent balancing ledgers by lamplight, making sure every worker got paid even if she had to skip groceries. He promised himself he would protect that legacy, even if it meant walking away from the most lucrative deal of his career. On the 12th floor, Compliance VP Cynthia Graves received a red flag alert on her dashboard. Ethical breach. Client hold. She'd been with Legacy for 25 years, had seen recessions, cyber hacks, you name it, but nothing spiked her pulse faster than an ethical hold on a contract this size. She opened the incident ticket, read the allegation, and clicked "Escalate to CEO" across town. Grace stepped off the bus. The lobby insult already filed into her mental archive of storms survived. She walked into a community cafe where she was due to mentor a group of first-time homeowners on negotiating fair loan terms. Because storms, she believed, become less frightening when you help others build sturdy roofs. Her phone buzzed. J.T. Short message. Holding contract. Love you. And she smiled, sipping coffee that tasted suddenly brighter. Meanwhile, Kenneth swaggered into his office, opened LinkedIn, and posted a brag about maintaining high standards in client vetting. He failed to notice that 2 of his direct reports had marked the post as concerning content under company policy, and far above in the corner suite. CEO Everett Dorsey stared at the compliance alert, reading the phrase "6 billion exposure" 3 times before it felt real. He summoned Cynthia, demanded a risk briefing, then told his assistant to locate Kenneth Blake, even if it meant dragging him from the cafe mid-espresso. At 1:12 p.m., Laura took a deep breath and drafted an email to a general counsel address provided by Whitaker Tech's website. Attached is lobby footage from 9:07 a.m. Please confirm receipt. She clicked send. The rush of relief surprised her. Sometimes courage is as small as a file upload bar crawling toward 100%. By mid-afternoon, market rumors began trickling onto finance blogs. Legacy deal in limbo. Ethical breach allegations. Possible rival bank swoop. Traders dismissed it at first, but when Commonwealth First's stock ticked up 0.5 point on no news, ears perked. Inside Legacy. Executive assistants hustled between offices carrying folders labeled confidential. Kenneth, summoned to an emergency meeting, felt his mouth go dry for the first time all day. And J.T., sitting in his quieter office across town, stared at the clause he'd underlined and thought about bridges, how one hairline crack, left unfixed, can bring down an entire span. He dialed his mother again, just to hear her voice, and told her. "We're building something stronger," Grace replied. "We always do. Son." And the call ended on a silence full of trust. The sun tilted westward, throwing long beams of light across polished floors in both buildings, one bracing for fallout, the other preparing for a rebirth. And so, a single insult had climbed from a lobby to the C-suite, carried by cell phones, thumb drives, and the quiet resolve of people who refuse to let arrogance stand unchallenged, setting the stage for a collision between a bank's shiny facade and the bedrock values of the woman whose ID it tried to throw away. Pressure built inside Legacy Capital's glass tower like steam in a sealed pipe. And by 1:30, the polished lobby, sleek brass, imported marble, carefully curated palm court music, had no idea a reputational implosion was already underway 3 floors up, where Compliance Vice President Cynthia Graves and CEO Everett Dorsey huddled in a soundproof crisis suite. Scrolling through a timeline lit in angry red, 9:07 a.m., lobby insult captured in 4K, 10:45, Whitaker Technologies triggers Clause 27, 11:32, $6 billion contract placed on hold. 12:10, thumb drive footage delivered by teller Laura Nguyen. 12:42, market rumor of a values breach knocks Legacy stock down 4%. Everett, silver hair rumpled, tie loosened an inch, asked for liability numbers, and Cynthia, tapping her tablet, spelled it out with clinical calm, penalties for breach, possible fair lending investigation, a class action iceberg if the pattern of bias widened beyond one ugly moment. Meanwhile, Branch Director Kenneth Blake, blissfully unaware his career was now measured in minutes, sat in the executive cafe polishing off cedar plank salmon and a story he'd already told 3 times. How he saved the bank by bouncing a suspicious ID onto the floor. Each retelling grew sharper, crueler, and drew thinner laughs from junior managers who sensed the ground shifting under their Ferragamo loafers. Risk Officer Marco Ruiz, remembering the day his own Latina mother was turned down for a grocery store loan, excused himself, stepped into a hallway, and called a cousin at a civil rights law firm, asking quietly about whistleblower protections at private banks. Up in Whitaker Tech's sunlit atrium, Jonathan J.T. Whitaker convened an emergency leadership huddle. His tone stayed measured, but the room felt the steel under it as he ordered all data integrations with legacy frozen, instructed Treasury to reroute nightly sweeps to a neutral clearinghouse, and green-lighted silent talks with Commonwealth First, the rival bank that had once courted them with slightly higher rates but an unblemished equity record. PR Chief Dana Owens drafted a holding statement. Trust isn't negotiable, then rewrote it twice for warmth, ensuring it struck the right chord with a customer base that saw Whitaker Tech as more than lines of code. Back at Legacy, an internal Slack thread titled Ethics Hold pinged like popcorn. Anyone know what happened? Heard Blake said something racist. Video exists. And finally, a single crying face gif that shut the channel down. Silence, in digital spaces, can feel louder than a shout. Laura, still at her teller window, felt her phone buzz as colleagues sent private notes. Got screenshots if needed. We saw everything. Stay safe. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji and focused on her breathing. Thumb drive no longer in her purse because the compliance chain had it now, but the courage it symbolized still warm in her palm. At 1:45, Everett and Cynthia met with Human Resources. They drafted a termination packet for Kenneth, just in case the board asked for a head on a platter, and debated whether to include severance. Data kept pouring in. Rejection rates for minority-owned business accounts spiked during Kenneth's tenure. Internal emails surfaced, Kenneth instructing staff to watch for cultural mismatches. Each data point widened the fissure. In the lobby, Kenneth finally noticed something off. Assistants avoided his gaze. A security guard offered a terse nod instead of a salute. And then his calendar pinged an emergency meeting. Boardroom C, 2:30 p.m. He straightened his tie, assumed the spotlight awaited him, and strutted to the elevator, missing the way an IT intern crossed herself when the doors closed. Inside Boardroom C, 12 directors already sat with briefing packets titled Ethics Breach, Risk Assessment, covers still warm from the printer. When Kenneth entered, Everett gestured him to a side seat, small detail, but enough to rattle his swagger. Lights dimmed, video played, Grace Whitaker's ID skidding across marble. Kenneth's own voice, clear as a confession, calling the bank no bus depot and dismissing folks like her. The room winced as though one body. Kenneth tried context. Routine fraud check. Miscommunication. Yet each word slid on polished oak like a broken skate. The audit chair asked about the $6 billion withdrawal exposure. The HR chair asked whether Kenneth grasped the compliance impact. The PR chair worried about headline risk. Nobody asked about Kenneth's feelings. At precisely 2:59, while the board drilled him, Laura Nguyen tapped send on a second email to Whitaker Tech's counsel, attaching memos where Kenneth advised staff that certain profiles hurt branch optics. 10 minutes later, Whitaker General Counsel Benjamin Cordell forwarded everything to Legacy's audit committee. Professional courtesy laced with warning. Downstairs, market reaction accelerated. Commonwealth First's stock ticked up on whispers they'd land the Whitaker cash. Legacy slipped another 2 points. Fitch placed the bank on negative watch, and Bloomberg chironed Legacy Capital deal on ice across lobby televisions. Back at Boardroom C, Everett slid a pre-draft separation packet across the table. Kenneth's name was printed at the top. Termination for cause pending. Shock drained the color from his face. Arrogance rarely rehearses for consequences. At that same hour, Grace wrapped a first-time homebuyer workshop across town, placed pamphlets into grateful hands, and stepped into soft afternoon sun. Her phone buzzed. JT's short update. Evidence locked, board frying, love you. She smiled. Thinking of the way steel beams are tested, tension steadily increased until hairline cracks reveal themselves. Legacy's cracks were now wide enough for daylight. By market close, Legacy stock had fallen 7%, wiping hundreds of millions in value. Commonwealth first announced after hours that it had commenced strategic discussions with a significant technology client. Bumping its shares another point. PR inquiries piled up on Dana Owens's desk, but Whitaker Tech remained silent, letting facts do the talking. At sunset, Everett sat in his office, lights off, watching downtown windows reflect amber sky. He recalled something his college ethics professor had said. Banks run on confidence, not currency. Across the city, J.T. closed his laptop and whispered a promise to the glass. We build better. Kenneth, escorted by security to collect personal items. Picture frame, Mont Blanc pen, fantasy football trophy. Signed the disciplinary memo with a hand that finally trembled. Thinking how quick laughter turns to echo, Marco Ruiz emailed his cousin the whistleblower files. Laura Nguyen poured tea at home and felt, for the first time all day, that her lungs could take a full breath, and high above silent streets. A mother and a son watched nightfall over a skyline they'd helped shape and knew the hardest beams to set are the invisible ones. Honesty, respect, and the quiet steel of refusing to bend when arrogance kicks. The morning after Kenneth Blake cleaned out his desk, Legacy Capital's board assembled for an emergency session that felt more like a tribunal than a strategy meeting. And as the oak doors clicked shut, the skyline outside their 38th floor window glimmered with a spring rain that couldn't scrub the stain spreading across the firm's balance sheet. There were no pastries, no fresh coffee, just a single pot gone lukewarm and 12 directors bracing for the arrival of Jonathan J.T. Whitaker and his mother, Grace, whose security badges had been pre-cleared by compliance, an unprecedented courtesy normally reserved for regulators. At 9:30 sharp, the double doors opened, and the room inhaled as Grace stepped in first, a soft gray suit fitting her like quiet armor, followed by J.T., with a laptop tucked under his arm. Grace paused long enough to register every face, from the audit chair's tight smile to the HR director's downcast eyes, then took the seat traditionally reserved for client dignitaries, though dignitary barely covered the gravitas she carried. Without small talk, J.T. connected his laptop to the wall screen, cueing a timeline that began with the lobby insult and ended with the current pre-market bloodletting of Legacy's stock. Color-coded slides flashed claims data, internal memos, Kenneth's LinkedIn boasts, and real-time social media sentiment, a river of distrust cresting in red. He spoke plainly, every syllable paced like a metronome. Legacy's failure wasn't a single lapse, but a culture blind to its own bias. The $6 billion hold was now a formal cancellation, and Whitaker Technologies had executed an LOI with Commonwealth First for $6.3 billion. Effective tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern, gasps slipped from a few directors. One reached for her water in a gesture equal parts shock and reflex. Then J.T. offered them a choice. Release Whitaker Tech's funds within 24 hours. No exit penalties, no publicity pushback, or contest the cancellation and watch the uploaded evidence trigger a full federal review. The board recessed for 12 minutes, long enough to draft a unanimous consent, release the funds, waive all break fees, and, by nod from legal, invite Grace to address the group. When the directors re-entered the room, Grace rose, folded her hands, and let the hush settle. Her voice was soft, yet carried to every corner. the way a lull in a storm makes people lean in. She spoke of engineered stress tests, about how bridges stand only when tension and compression hold each other in balance, and how Kenneth's words revealed an imbalance that money could not counterweight. She reminded them that respect is cheaper than damage control, then thanked them for confirming it in real time. No anger, no gloat, just a lesson delivered with the courtesy they had failed to extend 24 hours earlier. After she finished, even the most hardened financier found himself nodding, not out of obligation, but because truth had been rendered undeniable. By 10:30, press releases left both institutions. Legacies read like a confession wrapped in apology, promising an independent equity audit. Commonwealth's announced a historic alliance with Whitaker Technologies, featuring a $100 million fund for small business owners from underserved communities. Market feeds exploded. Legacy slid another 8% before noon. Commonwealth spiked 4, then 5. As analysts hailed ethics arbitrage. Meanwhile, Kenneth sat in his suburban condo refreshing job boards. Calls went straight to voicemail, and the few recruiters who answered admitted off record that his name was radioactive. By afternoon, he switched off the phone and stared at the cardboard box he hadn't unpacked. Its contents suddenly felt like souvenirs from a life that no longer existed. Across town, Laura Nguyen finished her shift and found a handwritten note on her locker. "Your courage kept the bridge from falling. Thank you." It wasn't signed, but she recognized the CFO's rounded script. She tucked the note into her pocket, feeling a swell of relief so deep it almost hurt. That evening, Grace and JT met Marcus Allerton, Commonwealth's CEO, in a modest conference room lined with local art, not corporate gloss. They signed papers with pens that lacked engraved logos but felt, as Grace remarked, weighted just right. Marcus toasted with plain sparkling water to profit with purpose, and J.T. couldn't help picturing Kenneth's crystal glass the day before. How quickly glass shatters when the hand holding it forgets humility. Shortly after, Whitaker Tech employees received an all-hands video message. J.T. sleeves rolled, explaining the reroute, praising internal teams for acting faster than fear, and ending with a quote from Grace, "Dignity compounds daily," which sparked hundreds of emoji reactions from staff scattered across time zones. At 11:30 p.m., long after the signing, Grace returned to her quiet bungalow on Oakview Avenue, slipped off her shoes, and stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of chamomile. She reflected on the day, the power of calm facts. The sight of directors bowing their heads in acknowledgement, the knowledge that thousands of families tied to Whitaker Tech's supply chain would now benefit from a bank that respected them on sight. She also thought of Kenneth, not with spite, but with a sober recognition that some lessons carve deeper than a paycheck can heal. She whispered a small hope that he would find the humility to rebuild. On the opposite side of town, Everett Dorsey left a voicemail for the same diversity consultant he'd once deemed too radical, inviting an audit of Legacy's entire branch network. He ended the night drafting an internal memo titled "Bridging the Gap," vowing that every employee, from teller to treasurer, would complete bias training within 60 days. And this time the promise felt less like PR and more like repentance. CNN's early morning ticker summarized the saga succinctly. A billion-dollar reminder that respect is still good business. And somewhere in the pre-dawn dark, a city slept under bridges Grace once helped build. Bridges that still carried trains, traffic, and now, perhaps, a little more understanding. The ripple effects of Grace and JT's decisions spread through the corporate world the way a hard rain spreads across a quiet pond. Tight, concentric circles turning into rolling waves. And by Friday morning, those waves were breaking on shores far beyond Raleigh. Wall Street analysts re-ranked legacy capital as speculative, Regional banks held emergency calls about frontline bias training, and talk radio hosts from Boston to Bakersfield fielded calls from listeners over 50 who could recall their own moments of quiet humiliation at polished counters. Moments that now felt finally vindicated. But the most tangible impact unfolded inside Legacy's headquarters, where a newly created Equity and Ethics Task Force met at 7:30 a.m. sharp in a repurposed corner office once reserved for client entertainment. Stripped now of its leather Scotch cart and stocked instead with plain legal pads, an urn of bitter coffee, and a projected countdown clock reading 59 days to audit report. Acting Branch Manager Laura Nguyen, drafted into the task force alongside Risk Officer Marco Ruiz and several shell-shocked executives, opened the meeting by reading a line from Grace's keynote summary. A bank that forgets the worth of its smallest customer bankrupts itself one discourtesy at a time. And though she felt her voice quiver, the words landed with more weight than any PowerPoint she could have prepared. Over the next 2 hours, they pored over spreadsheets detailing loan approval disparities, rejection rate heat maps, and customer service transcripts. Each data point produced a hush that sounded a little like grief. Meanwhile, in a sunwash of morning light at Whitaker Technologies, J.T. sat with CFO Meera Patel reviewing the overnight clearing test to Commonwealth First, the ledger columns so clean they looked like piano keys. Funds moved without a hiccup, Meera said, tapping the screen, and J.T. allowed himself a small exhale, proof that integrity costs, but only once, while compromise charges compound interest forever. At 10 hours a.m., Commonwealth's PR team launched a campaign called Capital with Character, front-paged by a photo of Grace and JT, shaking hands with CEO Marcus Allerton under a simple tagline, "Where trust keeps the lights on." Financial bloggers seized on the narrative, calling it the best brand repositioning since Patagonia drew a line in the sand. Legacy's marketing director, who had already begun filming a summer ad featuring beach umbrellas and generational wealth, scrapped the draft and booked an emergency slot with a crisis communications firm. Across town, Kenneth Blake sat alone in a strip mall diner, stirring black coffee he couldn't taste, scrolling LinkedIn on a cracked phone, his feed, once a river of congratulatory comments and leadership matters hashtags, had turned into a desert of silence broken only by headline after headline. Legacy loses $6 billion. Courtesy of arrogance. Biased banker out. Ethics in... He considered typing an apology post, but the words clumped like wet sand in his mind. So instead he just scrolled, each swipe a little slower than the last. Back at Legacy, HR rolled out mandatory bias training modules, but Marco pushed for live workshops instead, arguing that change doesn't happen in silent clicks. The CEO agreed, green-lighting a series of town hall forums. The first drew standing room-only attendance, where a veteran loan officer admitted through tears that she'd approved fewer minority ventures out of habit, never considering those habits could cost billions. The honesty snowballed, turning confession into commitment. And by lunchtime, the mood in the building had shifted. Less panic, more purpose. Outside, the stock still struggled, yet a few long-time investors noted on calls that a clean-out period might actually make Legacy healthier long-term. Over at Whitaker Tech, Dana Owens finalized press kits for the Dignity Dividend Fund's first cohort of 50 entrepreneurs, contractors, app developers, solar roof installers, each receiving anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000 microloans, coaching, and a seat at monthly roundtables hosted by Grace herself. Business news anchors flagged the fund as evidence that good ethics attract good partners, referencing a new supply contract Whitaker signed with a veterans-owned firm, another domino fallen in the right direction. That afternoon, Commonwealth First's shares climbed 3% on sustained volume. Analysts credited moral alpha, a term coined in a viral Substack article that broke down how reputational gains translate to lower churn and higher cross-sell rates. In Raleigh, Grace visited the community center where she once taught blueprint basics to aspiring tradespeople. She donated 10 brand-new laser levels, engraved with dignity compounds daily, then stayed for coffee, laughing with tenants who now jokingly called her the 6 billion grandma. She downplayed it, but inside she felt a quiet pride that decades of holding her head high had finally become a beacon instead of a burden. She thought about Kenneth, too, and while part of her hoped he would someday understand the damage he'd done, a larger part focused on the people who would benefit because of his failure. That evening, Legacy's Equity Task Force sent out a state-of-the-audit email to all employees. Plain language, no jargon. We missed the mark. Here's how we'll fix it. The transparency stunned even cynics, and late-night Slack channels buzzed with employees sharing their own stories of biased moments they'd swallowed. Some offered solutions. Others simply said thank you. At nearly midnight, after a marathon strategy session, Everett drafted a memo to the board proposing a permanent seat for an outside ethics advisor, even though that meant sharing power. He referenced the loss as tuition for becoming a better institution. Across town, J.T. got one last call from Marcus, confirming the $6.3 billion settlement had cleared the Fed wire, then went home, stood on his balcony overlooking the sleeping city, and whispered a short prayer of gratitude toward the skyline his mother helped build, down on the street. Kenneth walked past closed storefronts, the phone in his pocket buzzing with another unread message from a recruiter politely passing. He stopped under a flickering lamppost, pulled the Rebuilding Trust booklet Laura had handed him days earlier out of his jacket, and began to read the first page. Change starts when you admit the story you've been telling yourself is wrong. He read it twice, then once more. As if by repetition, he could rewrite the chapter he'd just lived. Somewhere above him, lights in Legacy's tower stayed on late, not from corporate arrogance but from a new humility. Employees plotting more than profit lines, plotting bridges, like the ones Grace once drafted on napkins. And as dawn teased the horizon, market tickers already cued fresh headlines. Legacy seeks redemption. Commonwealth soars on ethics play. Whitaker Tech proves character is capital. Yet for many onlookers, especially those over 50 who'd endured a lifetime of small daily indignities, the headline that mattered most wasn't on a screen. It was the unspoken line that now hovered in the collective sense of what's possible. If dignity can topple a giant, then dignity can surely build something better in its place. 1 year later, just after sunrise on a warm June Thursday, the cavernous ballroom of the National Banking and Finance Forum in Atlanta pulsed with an anticipatory hush that felt almost electric, the way an auditorium settles before a symphony's first note. And seated among 500 gray-suited executives, community bank founders, and retired credit union chairs were dozens of ordinary people who had never attended a Wall Street conference before. Cafe owners financed through the new Dignity Dividend Fund. First-generation farmers who had finally secured working capital lines. And a handful of 60-something retirees who had traveled on their own dime because they wanted to see, with their own eyes, what happens when a single moment of disrespect is flipped into a year of relentless repair. At precisely 9 a.m., the lights dimmed, the chatter faded, and a spotlight settled on a modest wooden podium where Grace Whitaker, hair now fully silver, posture still ruler straight, stepped forward in a navy pantsuit soft enough to feel approachable, yet sharp enough to command any boardroom. She carried no notes, only a small laser-cut model of the bridge she'd built from balsa wood with her son decades earlier. The same model that had become an emblem for the phrase printed on every conference badge lanyard, "Respect compounds daily." She began without clearing her throat, her voice steady and resonant. pausing between clauses so the text-to-speech interpreters and the human listeners alike could follow every syllable. She told the room that exactly a year ago, a single careless sentence had cost a bank $6 billion. But that the real story wasn't the loss. It was the dividend. Nearly $100 million in new community lending. 300 full-time jobs created by the fund's first 50 entrepreneurs. Legacy Capital's rejection rates for minority businesses dropping 13 points after mandatory listening circles. And, perhaps most surprising, the quiet redemption arc of one Kenneth Blake, who now ran diversity and lending workshops for regional banks and had walked into the ballroom on a general admission pass. Sitting 3 rows from the back in a rental suit that didn't quite hide the nervous twitch in his knee. Grace clicked a remote, and the big screens flanking the stage lit up with side-by-side graphs, one showing Legacy's share price, which had bottomed out and then, after months of transparency and reform, leveled into a slow rise, the other showing Commonwealth First's deposits, which had spiked after taking on Whitaker Technologies and then shared those gains by launching 2 new low-fee checking products. Proof that conscience can move as many dollars as any algorithm. She let those images linger. No flashy transitions. Then spoke again, telling the audience that structural engineers learn early that a bridge is only as strong as its hidden beams. She challenged them to audit the hidden beams in their own institutions, in hiring pipelines, customer service scripts, LinkedIn posts fired off without a second thought. And she said the words slowly, almost gently, because truth delivered at the right tempo slips past corporate armor more effectively than any shouting match. Midway through her talk, she invited 3 entrepreneurs to the stage. Alicia Mendoza, whose solar roofing cooperative now employed 42 technicians and had just landed a county contract. Isaiah Brooks, who built a tablet app that teaches adult literacy through storytelling and was already licensing the platform to 2 state prison systems. And Elaine Carter, a 54-year-old nurse who'd opened an elder care home where residents tend a communal garden, reducing medication costs and loneliness at the same time. Each told a 50-second story, voices trembling at first, then growing steadier as rows of bankers leaned in when they finished. Grace turned to the audience and said, "These returns will never show up on your quarterly report, but they will echo in every community report you file for the next decade, and they will make your regulators smile for a change." Laughter rippled, soft, genuine. Executives nodded because they knew the bitter truth of compliance fatigue. Off stage, Jonathan J.T. Whitaker watched, pride and logistics interwoven in his expression, because later that afternoon he would present a session on smart contracts for inclusive lending, and press would inevitably ask if he planned to run for public office. But right now he was simply a son, listening to his mother turn pain into blueprint. When Grace reached her closing cadence, she held up the tiny bridge, turning it so the light caught each delicate truss, and said, "My son and I built this together when he was 8. We learned that tension and compression must stay in balance or the whole structure fails. Money pulls, purpose anchors. If you remove either, collapse is inevitable." She placed the model on the podium, stepped back, and the ballroom rose in a standing ovation that lasted long enough for the house lights to come up, long enough for Grace to walk down the stage stairs where Kenneth waited, hands clasped, eyes wet. He leaned forward, whispered something the cameras couldn't catch, and Grace answered with a small nod before security ushered the flow of well-wishers toward the coffee stations. Reporters swarmed J.T. in the corridor, but he kept his answers tight. Yes. The partnership with Commonwealth was exceeding forecasts. Yes. Legacy's efforts at reform were encouraging and necessary. No. He hadn't ruled out a public service run, but right now his office was wherever people are building something honest. Meanwhile, Kenneth found a quiet corner near a potted ficus and opened the dog-eared Rebuilding Trust booklet Laura had handed him months earlier. He had underlined a sentence. Accountability hurts only as long as denial lasts. And when a junior banker recognized him and whispered, "Are you really the guy who lost $6 billion?" Kenneth answered, "I'm the guy who learned what $6 billion feels like when it walks out the door." Then handed the young man his business card that read, simply, Kenneth Blake, ethics trainer. Back on stage. Conference staff cleared chairs for the next session, but the buzz in the hallways refused to fade. Hashtags moral alpha and hashtag respect compounds trended on finance Twitter, and a cable news crawl summarized the keynote as proof that dignity scales. Later that day, Legacy's CEO Everett Dorsey, tuning in via livestream from Raleigh, sent an all-staff memo announcing an annual Grace Whitaker Fellowship for first-generation college students pursuing finance, funded by executive bonus rollbacks. It wasn't penance, he wrote. It was proof that the lesson had landed. Sunset painted Atlanta in copper tones as the forum wrapped. Grace and JT walked a quiet sidewalk toward their hotel, passing a street musician playing Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and Grace chuckled at the on-the-nose soundtrack. "Think we moved the needle today?" J.T. asked, stepping around a puddle reflecting neon. "Needles move," Grace said, squeezing his arm. "But tonight we helped set the compass." Up ahead, the hotel's glass doors glowed like a finished span waiting for traffic, and somewhere back inside the convention center, a volunteer packed the little wooden bridge into a foam-lined case headed for the Smithsonian's new exhibit. Finance and Fairness, Turning Points in American Capitalism. The label on the crate read, Artifact No, 001, Engineered Purpose. So, as city lights blinked on across rooftops, as boards revised charters and small towns received microloan approvals, the simplest truth hummed beneath it all. A single moment of dignity held firm can reroute money, mend institutions, and teach even the proudest banker that strength is measured not in towers of glass, but in the quiet steel of a person who refuses to bow when someone tells her she does not belong. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes respect should never be earned. It should be automatic. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what dignity really looks like, even when the world forgets.